A 9-year-old boy walked less than 50 yards through a crowded campground to get cookies from a truck, and somehow he never reached it. 10 months later, pieces of his skeleton were found in the mountains with punctures in the skull that seemed to explain everything. A cougar had been there. For a moment, the silence, the failed search, and the missing body all appeared to have one brutal answer. Then, specialists examined the bones more carefully and discovered that the cougar had bitten David Gonzalez after he was already dead. The animal everyone wanted to place at the beginning of the story had entered it too late. In Texas, another man was found with catastrophic injuries around his neck. The sheriff announced that a mountain lion had killed him, but wildlife specialists examined the scene and said they could not find evidence of a predatory mountain lion attack or another wild animal attack. The final medical ruling still said animal attack, yet the species was never identified. In Alaska, a hunter vanished for decades before a single skull restored his name, and bare teeth had penetrated the bone. Investigators could establish contact with a bear, but not whether the bear met a living man or a dead one. In one case, the animal arrived too late. In another, the animal was never named. And in the third, nobody could determine on which side of death the animal belonged. That difference may be only minutes. It can separate a predator killing from an accident, a medical collapse, a human encounter, or a death whose first cause has disappeared completely. A bear can drag a body away from the place where someone died. Scavengers can scatter remains across ground already searched. And a cougar can leave the most dramatic marks in the case without being responsible for the death itself. By the time investigators arrive, the wilderness may have preserved the ending while erasing the beginning. And once the beginning is gone, the recovery scene can look certain even when the most important event is missing from it. Some of the strangest recovery maps become less impossible once that is considered. The victim may never have traveled to the place where a skull, jacket, or bone was eventually found. An animal may have made that journey instead. But that does not close the case. It moves the question backward. If the victim never went there, where did the animal find them? If the body was moved after death, where was it before it moved? And if searchers were following the route of the remains rather than the route of the living person, how far back does the real disappearance actually begin? Nothing tonight proves an unknown predator, a portal, or anything outside documented biology. The cases do not need that. The disturbing part is the blank interval before the animal enters the evidence, because that interval can hold an accident, another person, another animal, or something for which the surviving evidence no longer has a name. That is where the mind naturally begins to wander towards stranger possibilities, especially when the ordinary explanations account for the body, but not the disappearance. Watch the order of events, the objects that belong to the victim while they were still alive, and the moment an official explanation changes. The animal standing over the remains may be the killer, the scavenger, or merely the first witness that can never tell us what it found. This is Echo 7. On July 31, 2004, Hannah Flat Campground near Big Bear, California, was busy with the ordinary activity of a summer campground. Families occupied the sites, vehicles were parked along the roads, children moved between tents and picnic tables, and adults were close enough that a serious emergency should have attracted attention. This was not a child disappearing miles into isolated backcountry. 9-year-old David Gonzalez vanished in a place where almost every direction should have contained another set of eyes. David wanted cookies from the family truck and asked his mother for the keys. She handed them to him, and he started toward a vehicle less than 50 yards away. There was no difficult trail, no river crossing, and no long stretch of forest where a child could gradually become disoriented. The trip should have lasted seconds. Instead, somewhere between his mother and the truck, the expected sequence stopped. David did not return, and when the family checked the vehicle, it was still locked with the cookies still inside. That reduced the first phase of the disappearance to an incredibly small piece of ground. David apparently did not reach the truck, yet nobody could establish a reliable direction in which he had left the campground either. Searchers moved quickly because a child who had been missing only minutes should still have been relatively close. Volunteers joined professional teams, dogs were used, and helicopters searched from above. At different stages, close to 200 people were involved. checking roads, slopes, forest, and the wider terrain around Hannah Flat. They did not find the obvious clue everyone expected. There was no clean route showing that David had wandered away, no discarded clothing marking a direction, no obvious disturbance revealing the point of an attack, and no body inside the rapidly expanding search area. Then there were the keys his mother had physically placed into his hand immediately before he disappeared. They were not found near the truck, not recovered between the vehicle and the campsite, and not later identified with the limited remains. A set of keys is easy to lose in forest litter, but these particular keys belonged to the last confirmed action in David's story. As the search spread farther into the surrounding wilderness, the possibility of a mountain lion became difficult to ignore. Cougars live in the Big Bear region. They can approach quietly, strike rapidly, and move prey away from an initial location. Suddenly, one predator seemed capable of answering several problems at once. David did not need to walk miles if something else carried him. Searchers did not need to miss a stationary child if the body was no longer near the place where the disappearance began. The theory could also absorb the silence. A sudden ambush could leave little opportunity for a sustained scream, and if the keys remained in David's hand or clothing, they could have moved with him. It was a terrible explanation, but it was efficient, and efficient explanations become powerful very quickly in cases full of empty space. Yet the campground created a problem for the theory. A cougar taking a child from close to tents, vehicles, and people would have to operate inside a human environment, and nobody produced the point where such an attack began. 9 days of intensive searching ended without David. Then time began doing what it does to every outdoor death scene. Tracks disappeared, scent weakened, weather changed, and anything biological continued to deteriorate. Almost a year later, hikers found partial human remains in the broader area. Dental records confirmed that they belonged to David, and only about a quarter of the skeleton had been recovered. There was animal damage on the bones. For the first time, the old cougar theory seemed to have physical evidence behind it. At an early stage after the discovery, the possibility of a mountain lion attack was publicly discussed, and the story appeared to close itself. A child vanished in mountain lion habitat. Searchers failed to find him, and months later, his bones emerged with predator marks. It was the kind of sequence that feels complete before the examination is complete. Then the specialists looked closer. Multiple animals had interacted with the remains. Some damage was consistent with a possible young cougar, while other marks were associated with additional scavengers. More importantly, the examination did not support the idea that a cougar had caused David's death. Critical punctures were determined to have been made after death. The mountain lion had been there, the feeding had happened, and the damage was real. But the connection between that animal and the moment David died had disappeared. The cougar could help explain why the skeleton was incomplete and why some of the remains were altered or moved, but it could not explain why a dead 9-year-old child was available for scavenging in the first place. The animal evidence solved part of the recovery scene and at the same time reopened the disappearance. The case was suddenly thrown backward almost a year to a walk of less than 50 yards. David leaves his mother with the keys, does not reach the cookies, and then disappears from the record. No confirmed abduction explains it, and the cougar no longer explains the death. By the time pieces of him are found, the wilderness has already removed much of what might have settled those questions. The surviving clues now belong to different moments. The keys are part of the living child's last ordinary action and vanish completely. The cougar marks are created after death and survive in bone. That separation is more disturbing than the physical distance in the case. The evidence closest to David's disappearance is missing, while evidence from the aftermath is preserved well enough to dominate the story. A long wilderness disappearance gives the mind room for fatigue, wrong turns, and miles of accidental movement. David's does not. He was supposed to cross a tiny piece of a busy campground, open a truck, and return with cookies. If he never reached it, whatever changed the day entered that routine quickly. Did he notice something and step away, suffer an unseen accident, encounter another person, or leave the immediate area in a way the surviving remains can no longer reconstruct? That is the missing 411 quality of the case, without adding anything supernatural. The unexplained part may not be far away at all. It may be almost beside the people who were searching for him. The search itself adds another layer because the first assumption in a missing child case is movement. Searchers look for the route a child could have taken, the place he might have fallen, the point where a dog can pick up direction. David's later remains introduce the possibility that at least part of the final geography was created after death. If scavengers moved portions of the body, then the place where bone was eventually recovered may answer where animals traveled rather than where David traveled. That leaves the smallest and most important map almost untouched, the few yards between the campsite and the truck. Christopher Whiteley's case begins almost at the opposite end. Instead of a disappearance that slowly develops an animal theory, this one begins with authorities apparently having an answer. On December 3, 2020, 28-year-old Christopher was found dead in wooded terrain near Lipan, Texas, with severe injuries around his neck. The Hood County Sheriff's Office announced that he appeared to have been killed by a mountain lion. The possibility was taken seriously enough that wildlife personnel became involved and a federal trapper examined the scene. If a large cat had just killed an adult man, it might still be in the area, and a fatal cougar attack in Texas would have been an extraordinary event. The initial explanation, therefore, had consequences beyond the death investigation. There was potentially a dangerous predator to locate. Then, Texas Parks and Wildlife examined the evidence and did not agree. Their specialists said the available scene did not show evidence of a predatory mountain lion attack. The assessment did not simply question which cougar was responsible. They did not identify convincing evidence of another wild animal attack either, and a federal wildlife specialist reached a similar conclusion. The two official readings of the same death no longer described the same event. One official side believed Christopher had suffered fatal animal trauma and initially identified a mountain lion. Specialists trained to evaluate wild animal attacks said the evidence they saw did not support that reconstruction. Nobody needed to invent a hidden conflict because the conflict was already in the record. What kind of scene allows the body to say animal while the ground refuses to name the animal? Was the important evidence on Christopher rather than around him? Had the scene changed before wildlife specialists examined it? Or was the fatal encounter simply unlike the classic pattern they were looking for? The final medical examination was expected to settle the issue. Christopher's death was eventually classified as accidental, with traumatic neck injuries caused by an animal attack. Yet the mountain lion disappeared from the final conclusion, and no other species took its place. The case had moved from a specific predator to a broad category, leaving the strangest part untouched. Something caused those injuries, but the final file could not tell the public what that something was. Different disciplines can read different parts of the same death. A medical examiner studies the body, while wildlife specialists may focus on tracks, predatory behavior, bite patterns, and the surrounding terrain. Fatal injuries can be consistent with animal trauma without preserving enough information to identify the species, and a domestic or feral animal could leave a scene unlike a classic cougar attack. Even with those possibilities, the unanswered point remains unusually specific. The final ruling keeps animal attack while the species disappears. If a wild predator caused the neck trauma, why did the wildlife specialists reject the signs they expected to see? If the animal was not wild, what kind of animal was capable of producing those injuries there? Could the body have preserved evidence that the ground no longer did? The file does not support an unknown creature, but it does leave an officially unnamed animal at the center of a fatal event. What makes Christopher's case memorable is the direction in which certainty moved. It began with mountain lion, then the wildlife interpretation challenged that name, and the final ruling kept the category while dropping the species. The death can be classified without the final sequence becoming equally specific, and that is enough uncertainty for the case to remain unsettling without adding anything to it. Later, there will be a scene that looks far more conclusive than Christopher's. 3 mountain lions will be physically feeding on a human body, close enough for wildlife officers to see them with their own eyes. If any animal scene should be able to end the argument, it is that one. It does not. Keep that image in mind, because when we finally reach it, the most obvious answer in the entire episode will turn out to belong to the wrong part of the story. Far north of Texas, Bart Schleier's disappearance develops in a completely different way. Bart was not simply comfortable in wild country. His professional life included work with large carnivores, and few people around him doubted his ability to understand bears, terrain, and the risks of moving alone through remote country. In September of 2004, he was dropped by float plane at Reed Lakes in the Yukon to hunt moose. The pilot planned to return roughly 2 weeks later. On September 27th, the aircraft came back to the agreed pickup location. Bart was not waiting. The camp was there, and what made it strange was how little chaos surrounded it. An action packer still contained food. The remains of a partially eaten meal were present, and equipment including a knife, pepper spray, and a radio had been left behind. The camp did not look like the aftermath of a bear tearing violently through everything available. His tent presented another puzzle. Contemporary descriptions said it had become tightly wrapped or tangled in the surrounding brush, but there were no obvious tears, no blood, and no clear struggle at the tent itself. The sleeping bag was missing, which briefly raised the possibility that something had dragged Bart from camp during the night. Yet the evidence around the site did not make that scenario straightforward. Searchers later found Bart's raft about half a mile away, tied to brush along the lakeshore. Several days afterward, friends concentrating on the area near the raft found something more revealing in the forest. Bart's bow, quiver, and moose call were leaning neatly against a tree, with a dry bag nearby that he may have been using as a seat. It looked like a place where a bow hunter could settle in and call a moose close enough for a shot. Then the scene changed. A camouflage face mask with blood and hair was found nearby. Roughly another 100 yards away were bones, including part of a skull. Additional searches produced more remains, a cap, torn camouflage pants, and a camera. The teeth from the skull were used to identify Bart. A grizzly attack immediately became the leading natural explanation. He was alone in bear country, calling moose in thick vegetation, exactly the kind of situation in which a bear could potentially approach without giving much warning. Bart's skill did not make him immune to one close encounter. A charge beginning at short distance can erase the advantage of experience almost instantly. Yet a Yukon conservation officer involved in the search said the scene was not characteristic of a typical bear mauling site and described the cause of death as inconclusive. There was no obvious area of violent struggle with torn moss, broken branches, or heavily disturbed ground. The dry bag Bart may have been sitting on remained undisturbed. There was no pile of vegetation resembling the kind of material a bear might use to cover carrion. Even the scat created questions. Investigators found bear and wolf sign in the area, but no clothing fabric was identified in the animal scat. Most of Bart's clothing was never recovered, and the remaining bones had no flesh on them. The food back at camp was also largely untouched, as were much of his gear and the raft. Taken together, those details still do not rule out a grizzly attack. Bart may have placed his equipment against the tree, moved only a few steps, and been surprised before he could reach the bough. The attack may have happened so quickly that a broad struggle area never developed. A bear interested in the man or in another food source does not have to ransack the camp afterward. The uncertainty comes from what happened once scavenging began. Bears, wolves, or other animals can rapidly destroy the very details investigators would need to distinguish a fatal attack from feeding after another cause of death. Soft tissue disappears, clothing moves, bone becomes damaged, and the original body position vanishes. A natural death, followed by scavenging, can eventually resemble an attack, just as a real attack can lose the evidence that once made it obvious. The bow matters because it belongs to Bart's intention, not to the animals that came later. A predator can move a body, tear clothing, and scatter bone, but it did not lean the bow, quiver, and moose call against that tree. Bart did. The last clear human action in the scene is therefore still visible, while whatever immediately followed it is gone. A grizzly approaching through thick cover remains one of the strongest explanations. Bart could have been focused on calling a moose, stood for a reason that seemed harmless, and been overwhelmed before he understood what was coming. The absence of a dramatic struggle does not rule that out. Yet the arrangement invites a question that general bear behavior cannot answer. What made an expert hunter move away from a weapon that was close enough to touch? Maybe the answer lasted only seconds and was entirely ordinary. He heard movement, shifted position, and never had time to return. But the scene leaves a strangely clean boundary between deliberate human order and everything that came afterward. On one side, equipment placed for a purpose. On the other, blood, hair, and remains altered by predators. The few steps between those worlds are the part the wilderness did not preserve. There is another reason the setup feels so uncomfortable. A bow hunter calling moose is not wandering without purpose. He chooses a position, places equipment where it can be reached, and waits for an animal to respond. The scene near Bart's tree therefore carries a kind of human logic that the later remains do not. Whatever broke that logic did so quickly enough that the bow stayed where he had placed it. A grizzly can explain that. So can a sudden movement that drew his attention for only a moment. The mystery is not that he left the weapon miles away. It is that he appears to have been only steps from it when his control of the scene ended. The next case almost looks as if the suspect had been left behind for authorities to examine. In the winter of 1977, 58-year-old trapper Ed Wilkinson disappeared from the Yukon. He lived with his brother Jared at an abandoned trading post called Lansing, where the Lansing River meets the Stewart River. Jared left by dog sled to work his trap line and was delayed by severe cold for about 2 weeks. As Jared approached Lansing on his return, he found a dead grizzly roughly 1.5 miles from the cabin. The animal lay on the riverbank, old and severely emaciated, with its bones visible beneath the hide. Ice had formed around its mouth in the snow, suggesting it had remained there breathing for some time before dying. This was not a healthy bear that had simply dropped dead without warning. When Jared reached the cabin, the situation became stranger. The temperature had been bitterly cold, yet snow covered the chimney, showing that no fire had burned for some time. A book Ed had been reading before Jared left was still open on the table. Cookies made shortly before the departure were untouched, and firewood stacked near the stove had not been used. The cabin did not look like a place Ed had calmly prepared to abandon. A nearby trapper joined the search, and the men found the hood from Ed's parka. It had been torn away, and there was frozen blood on it. A larger search followed. Investigators found snow, leaves, and sticks piled in a way that resembled the kind of cache a bear might build over a carcass, but there were no human remains beneath it. Shreds of clothing and frozen blood were scattered in the surrounding area. Wolf scat was also found, and some material inside it appeared to resemble human hair. A biologist later considered that evidence inconclusive, but the possibility that wolves had fed on Ed after whatever happened remained part of the reconstruction. Meanwhile, the dead grizzly became the obvious suspect. Stories circulated that Ed had stabbed the bear during a desperate fight and that the animal later died from the wound. The biologist who examined the bear found no stab wound. There was an older injury on the shoulder, but nothing that supported a fresh knife fight with Ed. The animal was missing 7 teeth. Most of the remaining teeth were worn almost to the gums, and it weighed only about 200 pounds when a healthy bear of that type could have weighed far more. Its stomach was empty. The biologist concluded that the bear had died from starvation. At the later inquest, he also explained that the state of the digestive process made it impossible to determine conclusively whether the bear had eaten Ed. Months after the snow melted, another search produced only Ed's hat and a button. A coroner's jury eventually ruled out foul play and concluded that Ed had been killed by a bear. The prevailing scenario was that he encountered the starving grizzly while checking a nearby trap, perhaps without carrying his rifle because he expected something far smaller. The coroner's conclusion may be exactly right. A starving winter grizzly near a missing trapper, combined with blood, torn clothing, and a cache-like disturbance, creates a strong natural case. What keeps the scene from feeling fully closed is that the suspected predator itself was recovered and examined while Ed was not. Investigators could inspect the bear's teeth and stomach, yet there was no complete body to compare against the animal and no preserved attack site that let one event lead visibly into the next. If the grizzly killed Ed, where did the attack begin? Why did a place resembling a bear cache contain no human remains? How much did wolves change afterward? The empty stomach does not settle those questions because an animal that had been starving for a long time could still have encountered Ed before dying, and digestion complicates what would remain to be found. None of this disproves the bear conclusion. It explains why the conclusion can be plausible without every step becoming visible. Ed's disappearance inverts the usual animal investigation. The suspected predator is lying dead in the snow while the victim is missing. That image naturally pulls the mind toward something stranger, but the evidence does not require anything exotic. It simply leaves the exact moment when Ed, the bear, and perhaps later scavengers entered the same chain of events beyond reconstruction. The cabin makes Ed's disappearance harder to read as a simple decision to go somewhere else. The open book, untouched food, and unused firewood all belong to routine interrupted rather than routine completed. The details do not prove the manner of death, but together they narrow the emotional shape of the scene. Ed did not leave behind a cabin that looked prepared for an extended winter absence. He left behind ordinary life in midstream, and the first violent evidence appears outside with the torn hood and blood. The distance between those two scenes is small enough to feel reconstructible, yet the reconstruction never becomes complete. Gary Frank Southerton's disappearance turns the problem inside out. His case eventually showed how modern science can solve a question that once looked impossible while remaining helpless against a much smaller one. Gary disappeared during an Alaskan hunting trip in the 1970s, and no search at the time produced a definitive body. In July of 1997, a hunter found a human skull along the Porcupine River, roughly 8 miles from the Canadian border. Troopers searched the area but did not locate other remains. The skull went to the medical examiner unidentified, although the pattern of damage suggested contact with a large bear. For years, investigators knew more about what had happened to the skull than about the person it belonged to. The locations, shapes, and sizes of tooth penetrations were consistent with bear predation, but there was no name attached to the bone. That changed decades later when genetic genealogy allowed cold case investigators to connect the remains with Gary's family. After almost half a century, the skull had a name. The investigation could finally answer who had been found. Yet Alaska state troopers still drew a careful line around the cause of death. The bear activity was evident, but it was not known whether the bear had caused Gary's death. That difference is enormous. A living victim and an already dead body can both receive devastating damage from a bear, which is exactly why the skull alone cannot settle the order of events. Without the rest of the body, fresh tissue, or a preserved scene, the skull cannot necessarily distinguish between those events. Gary may have been killed by a bear, and that remains a very plausible explanation in remote Alaska. He may instead have suffered a fall, exposure, a sudden medical event, or some other fatal problem before the bear found him. If the evidence of that first event existed on a portion of the body never recovered, then the skull could preserve the second event perfectly while knowing almost nothing about the first. As the science improved, Gary's mystery did not disappear, it contracted. First, the unknown was enormous because nobody knew where Gary was. Then the skull appeared and the question became, who is this? Genetics eventually answered that too. At the end, decades of technological progress ran into one interval that may have lasted only minutes. Was there still a heartbeat when the bear's teeth reached him? Or had the animal found a man whose death had already occurred somewhere outside the surviving evidence? No database can answer that from evidence that no longer exists. The mystery survived not because technology failed, but because the missing information may have disappeared before the technology was invented. That is almost harder to accept than an unsolved identity. Investigators can reach across half a century and return a name to a skull, yet a few final minutes remain more inaccessible than all the decades around them. Gil Clark's case in California presents a newer version of the same problem, but the suspected role of the animal is completely different. Gil was 78 when he disappeared from the Goodyear's Bar area of Sierra County in August of 2025. Searchers examined the routes and terrain around his home, yet no body was recovered. In November, a new search found clothing and personal items belonging to Gil near his home. The discovery created a real physical point in a case that had been almost entirely absent. Cadaver dogs were brought into the area the following day, but no additional evidence produced the complete body investigators needed. The Sierra County Sheriff's Office eventually described what it considered the most likely scenario. Gil may have suffered a medical emergency near his home that incapacitated or killed him, after which a bear or mountain lion may have dragged the body away. In this case, the animal was not primarily being used as the cause of death. It was being used to explain why the cause of death could no longer be examined directly. The proposed sequence is completely plausible. Gil suffers a sudden medical crisis, collapses, and dies alone. A predator discovers him later, moves the body into denser terrain, and separates clothing along the way. Smaller scavengers become involved. Weather changes the scent environment, and the original place of collapse loses its relationship with the eventual recovery points. But if that happened, the clothing may mark the route of the animal rather than the place where Gil fell, and the cadaver dogs may have been searching a scene that had already been pulled apart. The same post-mortem process would not care how Gil died. The body of someone who suffered a heart attack, fell, or died through another cause can be moved just as easily by a bear after death. That is not evidence that anything criminal happened to Gil. It means the recovered objects may belong to a second event that overlays the first. If so, the evidence found near his home may tell investigators where something carried him, not where his life actually ended. Every apparent answer sends the investigation one step backward. First, the question is where Gil went. Clothing is found, and the question becomes where the body went. If an animal moved the body, the next question becomes where it found him. If the medical event happened before that, what evidence from the collapse survived at all? The more plausible the movement theory becomes, the less trustworthy the recovery point becomes as a map of Gil's final living moments. Without the remains, the medical emergency theory cannot be confirmed in the ordinary forensic way. Without the original scene, the movement theory also becomes difficult to reconstruct. A perfectly natural chain of events can therefore produce an eerie result. Belongings appear, search dogs return, wildlife activity is known. Yet the one thing capable of fixing the entire sequence in place is missing. The case stays open not because the proposed explanation is bizarre, but because the evidence that could prove it may have been carried away with Gil. James Barnes creates an entirely different kind of animal mystery because the animal in his case was not a predator or scavenger. It was his dog. James left for a hunting trip in British Columbia on October 18, 2024, with his golden retriever, Murphy. He failed to return, and his pickup was later found without either James or Murphy. A dog creates a second moving path inside a missing person investigation. If James was injured, Murphy might remain beside him. If the dog became hungry or frightened, it might leave, follow a road, approach a house, or return toward the vehicle. Two living beings entering the same wilderness should theoretically create more opportunities for evidence to emerge because either one could eventually appear. Then a golden retriever was found alive in the Halfway River area near Fort St. John. The resemblance to Murphy was strong enough to create real hope. If the dog belonged to James, the location could redraw the search map. Its condition might suggest how long it had been alone, and its injuries might hint at the kind of event that separated it from its owner. For a short time, the case seemed to have produced a witness that could not speak, a living animal whose body might still contain a root. DNA testing removed that root in a single result. The dog was not Murphy. The animal was real, the ordeal was real, and every question inspired by its appearance was reasonable. But all of it belonged to another story. James remained missing, the real Murphy remained missing, and the pickup remained one of the few fixed points in a case containing two moving subjects whose paths had vanished together. The false dog briefly made the landscape feel smaller because investigators had somewhere new to look. Once DNA removed that identification, the wilderness expanded again, and the case returned to a truck with no owner and a dog whose actual route was still completely unknown. A solo disappearance does not create the same geometry. If James suffered a disabling accident, what happened to Murphy? If James entered dangerous water, did the dog follow him or remain on land? If a predator attacked one of them, what happened to the other? If they remained together, what kind of terrain has hidden both? If they separated, what caused the separation? And why has neither side of that split produced a confirmed endpoint? All of those questions can still have completely natural answers. A hunter and a dog can both die in remote terrain through completely natural circumstances. What gives the case its strange pull is that a second living subject should create a second chance for the landscape to return something. Murphy could move independently, seek people, follow roads, or remain with James. Every option creates another physical path, yet both paths disappear into the same silence. The false Murphy made that silence easier to feel because for a brief period the case behaved exactly as people expected. A dog appeared, and suddenly there was direction, distance, and the possibility of working backward. Search logic could attach itself to a living animal. Then one laboratory result removed everything. It is difficult to imagine a cleaner demonstration of how quickly a missing person case can reorganize itself around a clue that later proves unrelated. The found dog had survived something, but not James's disappearance. The real Murphy creates a question no inanimate object can create. A rifle cannot decide to leave an injured owner. A backpack cannot return to a road, and a dog can. If Murphy stayed, that behavior might keep both remains in the same hidden location. If he left, his route could have carried him toward a road, a camp, or another human being. If he died separately, investigators inherit a second, unexplained event. The mystery is not that a dog must always find help. It is that every normal behavior available to Murphy should create another trail, and none of those trails has yet become a confirmed answer. The official uncertainty did not disappear with time. In a one-year update, the RCMP again appealed for information about James, which means the case had not produced the kind of later discovery that usually collapses the search area. No confirmed Murphy appeared, no recovered remains established where the pair separated, and the truck remained a starting point rather than an answer. That makes the false dog episode more than a strange side story. It briefly gave investigators the kind of directional clue the real case still lacked, then removed it completely. If cases like this are why you follow Echo 7, stay with the channel and subscribe. The strongest mysteries are not always the ones with the wildest claims. Sometimes one ordinary fact should make a disappearance easier to understand, and instead, it removes another piece of certainty. A dog should create another route. Here, that route disappeared too. Jordan Greider's case begins with something completely different. Before wolves enter the story, before bones are found, and before theories begin forming around scavengers, there is blood. In the fall of 2018, 29-year-old Jordan entered the Boundary Waters region of Minnesota and established a remote camp near the Sioux Hustler Trail. Contact later stopped. Winter made the search brutally difficult. On April 5, 2019, Forest Service officers located Jordan's campsite roughly 1.5 miles from the trail entrance. Snow was still extremely deep, making a broad search difficult, but investigators immediately found something that changed the character of the case. A large amount of blood was inside the tent, while Jordan himself was nowhere in the shelter or around the immediate scene. The first real location in the case was therefore not a body site. It was an empty room in the wilderness where something serious had already happened. The blood belongs to the earliest recoverable event because it existed while Jordan was alive and bleeding. Whatever caused it, he had suffered a serious injury in or around his shelter. If he later died somewhere else, did he leave the tent under his own power despite the blood loss? Or did the body leave that location later through some other process? The snow had protected the camp from easy access, but it had also erased the tracks that might have shown which direction Jordan moved, if he moved at all. Searchers returned as snow conditions improved, and skeletal remains were eventually recovered in the surrounding area and later identified as Jordan. The St. Louis County Sheriff's Office said the exact cause of death remained unknown and that foul play was not suspected. Later accounts have discussed post-mortem scavenging, including possible wolf activity, but the official record does not place wolves at the beginning of Jordan's death. That leaves the blood as the strongest surviving clue from the living timeline. Jordan may have suffered a severe accidental injury, lost blood, and tried to move before dying outside the shelter. Animals may have found the body later and altered the recovery pattern. An earlier animal encounter cannot be ruled in from the surviving evidence, but neither can it be turned into the answer simply because scavengers may have arrived afterward. The scene asks a more immediate question than what species was nearby. What made Jordan bleed so heavily inside the tent, and what did he do next? If he was badly hurt, why leave shelter in deep winter unless he believed something outside offered a better chance? If he never left under his own power, what explains the separation between the blood and the remains? Snow delayed the search and also erased the tracks that might have shown whether there had ever been a trail out of that shelter. Remove either half and the story changes. Without the campsite, later skeletal remains could make scavenging feel like the center of the case. Without the remains, the blood-filled tent would look like the last room occupied by a badly injured man who vanished into winter. Having both scenes only reveals how much is missing between them. The tent is disturbing because it belongs to Jordan while he was still alive. The later remains belong to a landscape that had already had months to alter the evidence. Somewhere between those two scenes, an injured man ceased to be present at the one location where his injury is still visible. The next case makes that timing problem even harder to ignore because the animal evidence there is almost impossibly strong and still belongs to the wrong part of the story. Deep snow also distorted the timing of Jordan's case in a way no later reconstruction could fully repair. The campsite was located in April, months after he had entered the area, and investigators initially could not conduct the kind of broad ground search they would have wanted because the snow remained so deep. That means the first preserved human clue, the blood, was separated from the search for the body by an environmental barrier. Whatever tracks once led away from the shelter, whether Jordan made them or something else did, were not waiting in spring as a clean line for investigators to follow. In December of 2019, human remains were discovered along the Pima Canyon Trail near Tucson, Arizona. 3 mountain lions were feeding on the body. They were not inferred from old tooth marks, distant sightings, or tracks in the dust. The animals were physically there with the remains. Their behavior made the scene even more disturbing. Wildlife officials said the mountain lions showed unusually little fear as people approached. They remained close to the body, and all 3 were ultimately killed because officials considered the behavior a public safety risk. For someone arriving with no other information, the conclusion seems almost unavoidable. A man enters mountain lion country. 3 cougars are found eating him. They refuse to leave when humans approach. The body has predator damage. How many people would keep looking for an earlier event? Wildlife specialists did. The autopsy determined that the mountain lions had not killed the man. They had found him after he was already dead. The victim was 66-year-old Stephen Mark Brazier of Oklahoma, and the investigation soon moved toward a person who had been traveling with him. Dalen Thornton was later connected to Brazier's vehicle, and the case developed through years of criminal proceedings. In 2025, Thornton admitted that he had left Brazier injured to die along the Pima Canyon Trail and pleaded guilty to negligent homicide and concealing a dead body. The wording matters. The final criminal resolution was negligent homicide, not the simple murder label that early charges and headlines sometimes attached to the case. But the central point for this investigation remains just as powerful. Stephen's death resulted from human actions before the mountain lions arrived. 3 predators were physically feeding on a man whose fatal sequence had begun with another human being. Every piece of animal evidence was genuine. The cougars were there, they damaged the body, and their behavior was dangerous enough for officials to kill them. Nothing had to be faked, misunderstood, or exaggerated. The error would come only from placing those true facts too early in the timeline. They were evidence of what happened to Stephen after the fatal human interaction, not evidence of what caused that interaction. If Thornton had never been connected to Stephen's vehicle, the animal scene might have swallowed everything else. Years later, people could point to 3 cougars on the body, missing tissue and disturbed remains, and ask what more evidence anyone needed. The unsettling part is that every one of those arguments would be built from facts. The error would be the order in which those facts were arranged. The criminal case eventually supplied the missing earlier chapter. Thornton pleaded guilty to negligent homicide and concealing a dead body after admitting that he left Brazier injured to die on the trail. That legal outcome does not turn every scavenged wilderness body into a suspected crime. It shows something narrower. A fatal human interaction can precede overwhelming predator evidence and become much harder to see once the animals take over the scene. Pima Canyon is therefore less a mystery than a warning. The mountain lions were not falsely accused of touching Stephen. They were doing exactly what the evidence showed. What they did not do was create the fatal human event that came first. A true clue placed in the wrong part of the timeline can mislead more effectively than a false clue because nobody has a reason to throw it away. That is the image to carry into the next cases. When a bear, cougar, or wolf is physically present, the scene may feel finished before the examination begins. Sometimes it is. Sometimes the animal is only the loudest thing that happened afterward. The power of the Pima Canyon scene comes from how quickly the eye wants to finish the story before the file does. 3 cougars over a body feel like a conclusion, not a clue. If the autopsy and the vehicle investigation had not existed, almost every later detail could have been absorbed into that image. Missing tissue would become feeding. Displaced remains would become dragging, and the absence of a clean human injury would become another consequence of scavenging. The animals did not need to hide the earlier event deliberately. Their normal behavior was enough to make the later scene louder than what came before. Great Smoky Mountains National Park provides an almost perfect comparison because 2 human deaths produced broadly similar final images with completely different causes. In September of 2018, William Lee Hill Jr. was found dead in the park while a bear had been feeding on his remains. From the discovery alone, a fatal bear attack was an obvious possibility. The autopsy produced a different answer. William died from accidental methamphetamine intoxication. The bear had arrived after death and scavenged the body. 2 years later, Patrick Madura died in the same national park. Once again, a bear was found feeding on human remains. This time, the final medical examination concluded that Patrick likely died from trauma caused by the bear. Same park, same broad species. Human remains being consumed in both scenes. One bear arrived after the person was already dead, while the other was connected to the fatal event itself. If those bodies had been discovered only as partial skeletons after a year of weather and scavenging, would investigators have retained the same certainty? The answer would depend on what injuries survived and what evidence remained readable. That does not create mystery where the original cases were solved. It demonstrates how much the timing of recovery controls what a body is capable of telling investigators. Fresh tissue can show hemorrhage, and hemorrhage can reveal whether trauma occurred while blood was still circulating. Saliva can sometimes be collected, wounds can be compared with clothing, tracks may still exist, and the original position of the body may retain meaning. Bone survives much longer, but bone often tells a different story. It remembers anatomy and damage while forgetting the soft biological details that establish chronology. California gave investigators the reverse version of that problem in 2023. 71-year-old Patrice Miller was found dead inside her home in Downeyville after deputies conducted a welfare check. A black bear had entered the residence and had clearly been feeding on her remains. The initial interpretation was that Patrice may have died first and the bear arrived later. She had significant health problems, and California had no previous documented fatal black bear attack on a human. A natural death followed by scavenging was therefore not an unreasonable starting point. The autopsy changed the sequence. Investigators found trauma around the neck with hemorrhage, indicating that critical injury occurred while Patrice was still alive. The bear had not merely entered a house containing a dead woman, it had attacked her. DNA testing later connected the bear euthanized near the property with the fatal attack, making Patrice's death the first documented fatal black bear attack on a human in California. Most of the later feeding damage was post-mortem, but enough tissue survived to reveal the part that came first. Patrice, David, and Gary form an uncomfortable three-way comparison. Patrice's surviving tissue placed the bear on the living side of the timeline. David's bones placed the cougar on the post-mortem side. Gary's skull preserved too little to say which side the bear belonged to. The animals are not changing to fit a narrative. The amount and type of evidence surviving around them is changing. Candace Berner's death in Alaska shows what the stronger end of that spectrum looks like. On March 8, 2010, 32-year-old Candace was killed near Chignik Lake. Investigators found wolf tracks, examined her injuries, collected biological material, and later tested wolves from the area. Genetic evidence connected wolves with Candace's body and clothing. The investigation also considered disease, physical condition, and other factors that might explain the behavior. The final conclusion was a predatory wolf attack. Several independent lines of evidence converged while the victim was alive, leaving far less room for the kind of timing problem that appears in the older skeletal cases. Michael Soltis provides another confirmed bear case while demonstrating how quickly that certainty could disappear if recovery were delayed. Michael vanished near Eagle River, Alaska, in June of 2018. Approximately 2 days later, a volunteer search group entered the area looking for him, and a brown bear attacked one of the searchers. Michael's body was found nearby. At that point, a natural sequence seemed obvious. The bear had killed Michael and then attacked the person approaching the body. Yet investigators still had to distinguish between two behaviors, because bears can defend carcasses they killed and carcasses they merely discovered. The attack on the searcher proved a dangerous bear was present around Michael's remains. It did not by itself prove what had happened to Michael earlier. In this case, the autopsy provided the missing connection and confirmed that Michael had died as a result of a bear attack. Change only the recovery time, and the same death could become much harder to classify. If Michael remained missing for 6 months, the bear would be gone, snow would cover the original ground, and scavengers could alter the remains. Nothing about the actual death would change, but the ability to prove it might. What Michael's case preserves is chronology, and that is the thing many older recoveries lose first. Rain destroys tracks, snow covers blood, decomposition removes tissue, and animals add fresh damage on top of old damage. A body can spend weeks becoming easier to recognize as something that was scavenged and harder to recognize as a person who died in one specific way. Recovery points can then form a second map over the first. A skull may travel after death, clothing may separate, bone may move through animals or water. The map that looks impossible may not describe where the missing person walked at all. It may describe what happened after walking was no longer possible. That resolves one apparent contradiction only to reveal another. Where did the post-mortem movement begin? For Gary, Jordan, and Gil, that question matters more than the final recovery point. If Gary's skull moved, where was the rest of him when the bear found it? If Jordan's remains were dispersed after death, where was the intact body before that happened? If Gil's belongings separated from him later, where did the original collapse occur? A huge wilderness mystery can shrink into a very small unseen interval, then grow again as the environment moves everything around it. Mike Williams shows the danger at the opposite extreme, where an animal was used to explain the absence of a body without confirmed animal contact at all. Mike disappeared near Lake Seminole in Florida in December of 2000. He had gone duck hunting. His boat and equipment became part of the investigation, and the search failed to recover his body. A theory emerged that Mike had fallen into the lake and that alligators had consumed him. The ingredients sounded natural enough: Florida, water, alligators, and no body. As time passed, that explanation became increasingly accepted, and Mike was eventually declared legally dead. There were problems. The weather around his disappearance was unusually cold, and alligator metabolism slows dramatically at low temperatures. Feeding activity would have been reduced. Equipment that surfaced months later also lacked some of the damage expected from the story that had developed. The most basic weakness was even simpler. There was no confirmed evidence that an alligator had touched Mike at all. The theory explained the missing body because the body was missing, creating a loop that was hard to escape. No remains were found, so alligators could explain their absence. The absence of remains then seemed to make the alligator theory more plausible. The longer the lake failed to return Mike, the easier it became to imagine that the lake and its animals had erased him completely. But absence is not the same thing as evidence, and years later the case would demonstrate exactly how dangerous that substitution can be. Years later, the explanation collapsed. Mike had been killed by Brian Winchester, who eventually confessed to the crime and led investigators to the body. The alligator theory had occupied the empty space created by the disappearance, while the actual cause involved another human being. Mike's case does not prove that alligators or other predators cannot remove human remains. They can. It proves that biological possibility is not case evidence. For years, an empty lake could not contradict the alligator story, so every failed search seemed compatible with it. Had no independent human evidence surfaced, that explanation might still be repeated today as the most reasonable answer simply because nothing remained to prove it wrong. The lesson extends beyond alligators. Water can be nearby without causing the death. Predators can live in the region without touching the victim, and exposure can be possible without being the reason someone vanished. When there is no body, the environment can become a substitute witness. Mike Williams shows how convincing that witness can sound even when it never saw the event. The eventual recovery of Mike's body made the earlier animal story look even more fragile. Winchester led investigators to buried remains far from the place where the hunting disappearance had been staged. The lake had absorbed years of attention because it was the last convincing environmental clue, while the true death scene existed somewhere else entirely. That is a useful warning for every case built around a final known location. The place where the story begins for searchers may be only the place someone wanted them to look, or simply the last place ordinary evidence was easy to find. If there is one broad explanation you think investigators should be especially cautious with when there is no recoverable body, leave it in the comments. Predator attack, drowning, exposure, or voluntary disappearance. I am not asking which one is usually wrong. I am asking which one can most easily become impossible to test because the same absence is being used both as the mystery and as support for the explanation. Companion animals create a different kind of evidence because sometimes the animal comes back while the person does not. Shizuka Matsuki disappeared while walking two dogs near the Silver Lakes Rotary Nature Park in Davie, Florida in June of 2018. A witness saw her with the dogs and later noticed the dogs alone near the water. One of the dogs had a fresh gash on its side. The animals remained close to the pond while authorities searched for Shizuka, creating a disturbing scene before investigators knew exactly what had happened. In this case, however, the uncertainty did not last. A large alligator was captured, and examination produced evidence that it had bitten Shizuka. Her body was recovered from the lake, and the physical evidence supported a fatal alligator attack. The dogs had not solved the case by themselves, but their location and condition became part of a timeline that could be compared with the human remains and the animal. That is what James Barnes and Murphy never provided. No dog came back. No body came back. There was no confirmed point where the two paths separated. A companion animal returning alone can feel like a witness that cannot speak. Where did it leave its owner? Why did it leave? What frightened or injured it? Why did it move toward people rather than remain at the scene? Those questions can create genuine leads, but they can also invite narratives that outrun the evidence. James's false Murphy demonstrated that perfectly. For a brief period, an injured golden retriever seemed capable of answering parts of the disappearance. People could imagine how far it traveled, how it became hurt, and where it separated from James. DNA testing erased every one of those interpretations at once. The dog was real, and its ordeal was real, but it belonged to another story. The same danger appears with predator evidence. A clue can be completely genuine and still belong to the wrong event. Humans naturally make movement meaningful. A dog appears somewhere, so the place must matter. A jacket appears somewhere, so the missing person must have traveled there. A skull appears, so the victim must have died at that point. A predator feeds, so the predator must have killed. Sometimes those conclusions are correct. Sometimes the evidence is telling the truth about something else. A confirmed mountain lion death in Colorado provides another useful contrast. On January 1st, 2026, Kristen Marie Kovac was killed on the Crozier Mountain Trail. The medical findings and the pattern of trauma supported a fatal mountain lion attack. There is no need to turn that case into an unresolved mystery. Cougars can kill people, and in Kristen's case, the evidence supported that conclusion. The existence of real fatal attacks is exactly why weaker cougar theories can be so persuasive. The mechanism is not fantasy. It happens. Kristen's case also shows how much clarity can come from evidence recovered immediately. Hikers encountered the scene while a mountain lion was still nearby, and later testing connected human DNA with one of the lions euthanized during the investigation. The value of that case is not that every fresh scene becomes simple. Investigators still had access to a living timeline. The body had not spent months exposed, the animal had not vanished into years of uncertainty, and the physical relationship between predator and victim could still be tested. Compare that with a skull found decades later, and the difference is not the danger of the animal. It is the survival of the evidence. The same is true for bears and wolves. Bears can move bodies, cougars can attack with very little warning, and wolves can consume or disperse remains. Every mechanism exists in nature, but capability is not chronology. A species being capable of doing something does not establish that it did that particular thing to that particular person. By this point, the cases have stopped behaving like one category. David has a child who does not complete a walk measured in seconds. Christopher has an official animal attack with no species left in the final ruling after the original mountain lion interpretation was challenged. Bart has a deliberate hunting position that ends before the blood begins. Ed has a dead, starving grizzly and no body to compare with it. Gary has a skull that can return a name, but not a cause. Gil has clothing without remains. James has a missing dog. And Jordan has blood inside a shelter whose owner is gone. Stephen Braz here adds the most uncomfortable lesson of all, because 3 mountain lions can be physically feeding on a man while the decisive event belongs to an earlier human interaction. Trying to force all of that into one phenomenon would destroy what makes the cases interesting. Some contain confirmed attacks. Some contain confirmed scavenging. Some probably involve accidents or medical events whose evidence degraded. Others stop before the first cause can be recovered. The common danger is simpler. Later evidence can become louder than the event that created the death. Bone survives longer than blood. Tooth marks survive longer than scent. And a predator standing over remains is more memorable than a quiet object left behind while the person was still alive. The small objects keep returning to the front of the story for a reason. David's keys are not dramatic, but they were there before the mystery existed. Bart's bow is only a piece of hunting equipment until you realize it was deliberately placed by a man who knew exactly where he was. Jordan's blood is less spectacular than scattered remains, but it sits closer to whatever first went wrong. The clue nearest the living person can be physically insignificant and still be the most important thing in the entire file. There is something unnerving about the order in which wilderness cases sometimes come back. A skull returns without a body. Clothing appears months after a search. A dog appears and turns out to belong to somebody else. A dead bear is recovered while the missing trapper never is. None of that suggests intention, and none of it proves anything supernatural, but it creates the sensation that the story has been returned in the wrong order. Investigators receive pieces from different moments and have to decide which moment each piece belongs to before they can even ask what happened. That is where stranger ideas begin to creep in. A child disappears across a distance that should take seconds. An expert hunter leaves his bow standing beside a tree. A tent contains enough blood to prove a serious injury, but the person who lost it is gone. It is easy to imagine something hidden beyond the tree line, an unknown animal, a presence that makes someone step away from safety, or some force that leaves no clean trail. The files do not establish any of those things. What they establish is the empty interval that makes people think about them. The difference matters. Rejecting a supernatural explanation does not make David reach the truck. It does not give Christopher's animal a species, put Bart's hand back on the bow, tell us whether Gary was alive when the bear reached him, return Murphy, or explain what first made Jordan bleed. Those gaps remain after the folklore is removed, and that makes them stronger than folklore. A useful test is to ask what each theory actually explains. A bear can explain a moved body without explaining the death that made the body available. A cougar can explain tooth marks without explaining a cause of death when the marks were made later. Scavengers can explain scattered remains without explaining an earlier injury. An alligator can be fully capable of consuming a body and still have nothing to do with the missing person in front of you. The moment absence itself becomes proof that the theory destroyed the proof. Caution should increase rather than decrease. The confirmed attacks keep that caution grounded. Candace Berner, Michael Soltis, Patrick Madura, Patrice Miller, and Kristen Marie Kovac show what it looks like when the animal can be connected to the living victim through wounds, hemorrhage, DNA, tracks, scene evidence, or several of those things together. There is no reason to turn those deaths into mysteries they are not. Real predators kill people, and that reality is exactly what makes a weak predator explanation so easy to believe in a case where the body is incomplete. The opposite cases are just as important. William Hill was already dead when the bear fed. The mountain lions in Pima Canyon arrived after Stephen Brashear's fatal human interaction. David Gonzalez had post-mortem animal damage without a recovered cause of death. In each one, the animal was genuinely present. The mistake would be to drag it backward into a moment the evidence does not place it in. Gary Southerton is perhaps the cleanest example because almost everything has been reduced to one bone question. His skull survived long enough to preserve tooth penetrations and enough genetic material to restore his identity. It did not preserve the biological difference everyone wants. Was he alive when the bear contact began? The same object can support a certain identity and an uncertain death at the same time. What disappears first in a death scene is often exactly what would answer that question. Blood patterns wash away. Soft tissue decomposes, scent changes, tracks vanish, clothing shifts, bodies are disturbed. Months later, a recovery site may contain several roots layered over one another. The root of the living person, the root of a predator, the root of smaller scavengers, perhaps water moving another piece again. When those points are plotted afterward, they can look like one impossible journey, even though the missing person never made it. That possibility can explain some details often treated as inherently mysterious. Remains may appear in searched terrain because they were moved or exposed later. Clothing can separate from the body without proving the person removed it. Bones can turn up at distances or elevations the victim may never have crossed while alive. Search dogs can fail because scent conditions changed or because the body was no longer where the living trail ended. Every mechanism there is ordinary, but several working together can produce a recovery scene that feels deeply wrong. There is a cost to every one of those explanations. If an animal moved the remains, the recovery point stops being the death point. If water moved a bone, that bone no longer maps the person's final route. If scavengers separated clothing, the clothing may no longer describe a decision made while alive. The more of the aftermath we successfully explain, the farther backward the real unknown moves until it can collapse into a few seconds no one witnessed. Those seconds are where the unsettling possibilities live. Did David notice something and leave the direct path? Or was he intercepted before he reached the truck? Did Bart stand because he heard a bear, a moose, another person, or something he considered harmless? If Jordan left that blood-filled shelter himself, what could have convinced a badly injured man that outside was safer than inside? Why does Christopher's final cause retain the word animal after the named predator disappears? The questions do not prove anything beyond nature. They simply show where nature no longer gives us enough information to close the door on every alternative. Echo 7 does not need to tell the viewer what belongs in those gaps. The stronger approach is to leave the documented edges visible and let the mind push against them. Maybe the missing interval contains bad luck. Maybe another human being. Maybe an animal interaction too degraded to recognize. Some viewers will inevitably imagine something stranger. The file does not confirm that leap, but it does explain why the leap feels tempting. Mike Williams is the warning against making it too quickly. His alligator story sounded natural because the lake could hide a body, and alligators lived there. Yet the explanation survived for years without animal evidence, and the truth turned out to be human violence. Pima Canyon is even more disturbing because the predator evidence there was real. The mountain lions really were feeding on Stephen Brashear. A viewer could be completely wrong while pointing at something completely true. So a predator at a body is not an ending. It is an event that needs a timestamp. Tooth marks need to be placed before or after death. Scattered bones need a mover before they can be treated as a root. A returned dog needs a confirmed identity before its journey can be attached to a missing owner. The question is not whether a clue is genuine. The question is which part of the story it belongs to. If one case changed direction for you when a single detail appeared, put that detail in the comments rather than an entire theory. Maybe it was David's keys, Christopher's unnamed animal, Bart's bow, Ed's empty bare stomach, Gary's skull, the false Murphy, Jordan's blood, or the 3 mountain lions over Stephen Brazier. The instant your first explanation stops working is often more revealing than the theory you build afterward, because it shows exactly where the evidence ceased to carry the story on its own. Across all of these files, investigators keep receiving endings first. A skull, a jacket, damaged remains, an abandoned camp, a dog without its owner, or a dead predator appears after the central event, and the work has to proceed backward. Sometimes the ending reconnects cleanly with the beginning. Sometimes it proves the animal came later. Sometimes the physical record simply stops. The missing section can be tiny. A mother puts keys in her son's hand. A hunter settles beside a bow and moose call. A man drives into the backcountry with his dog. A camper begins bleeding inside a tent. On an ordinary day, those moments are not dramatic enough to stand out. Then the record breaks, and when it resumes, the person is dead, missing, or reduced to evidence that has already been moved and altered. If there is any signature here, it is not a species or a landscape. It is the transition we cannot see between an ordinary human action and a later scene that no longer explains how that action ended. Sometimes the difference survives in hemorrhage, DNA, or tracks. Sometimes it survives only as an unanswered question. Sometimes it disappears entirely. When that transition is gone, the recovery scene can tell the truth and still mislead. The bear really was there. The cougar really did bite. Scavengers really may have moved remains. The dog really was found. Every statement can be accurate while the story built from them is wrong because the facts belong to different moments. False clues can be discarded. True clues from the wrong chapter are much harder to recognize. There is a darker human version of the same problem. Stephen Brazier and Mike Williams show that another person can occupy the first scene while animals or the environment dominate what is discovered later. That does not turn every ambiguous wilderness death into a crime. It means scavenging cannot be allowed to erase human possibilities unless the surviving evidence actually rules them out. Ecology can dismantle a scene without intention. A bear can move, remains away from the place where another person last interacted with the victim. A cougar can destroy tissue that contained an earlier wound. Smaller scavengers can separate clothing from bone, and water can move the evidence again. Nobody has to hide anything for the scene to become harder to read with every passing day. These cases can feel almost mystical, even when every known process is ordinary. The forest does not have to swallow a person in one impossible instant. It only has to erase the first few minutes more efficiently than it erases the aftermath. The loud evidence survives. The quiet evidence disappears. Years later, a tooth mark can be clearer than a cause of death, and a skull can have a name while the person who once carried it still has no final story. Maybe every unresolved case tonight has an ordinary answer. A bear attack that left too little tissue, an accident no one witnessed, a medical collapse followed by scavenging, a dog that died outside the search grid. That possibility does not weaken the mystery. In some ways, it makes it worse, because an ordinary answer that has become physically impossible to prove is not waiting behind a locked door. It may simply no longer exist in recoverable form. Future technology may identify another skull, connect DNA to relatives, or extract information from smaller samples. It cannot recreate tissue that decomposed decades earlier, rebuild tracks washed away before anyone knew to preserve them, or restore the exact position of a body that animals moved. Some cases remain unresolved, not because the right tool has not been invented, but because the relevant evidence stopped existing. What survives can be almost insultingly small. Keys that never return, a bow leaning against a tree, a hood with frozen blood, a skull with bear damage, a dog that should create another path but does not. a tent containing blood without the person who lost it. Those details sit closer to the living victim than the dramatic remains found later, and sometimes they are the last pieces untouched by everything that followed. Before accepting the obvious explanation, the next time a wilderness recovery shows predator damage, ask one question first. Was there still a heartbeat when the animal arrived? If there was, the predator may belong to the beginning as well as the ending. If there was not, then the claws, teeth, and scattered bones are describing another event, one that began only after the real mystery was already underway. Somewhere before the first bite, before the first bone moved, and before the first scavenger altered the scene, there was another moment. Maybe it lasted a minute, maybe only seconds. Someone may even have seen part of it without understanding what they were seeing. Perhaps it was entirely ordinary. Perhaps it was so unusual that the evidence needed to recognize it disappeared with the body. We cannot know from what survives. David Gonzalez starts toward a truck less than 50 yards away, and the Cougar enters later. Gary Southerden disappears into Alaska, bear marks survive, and the timing does not. Stephen Brashear is found beneath 3 mountain lions, but the fatal human interaction began before they arrived. Bart Schleier's bow remains beside the tree while the next moments disappear. Christopher Whiteley's death remains an animal attack without the species originally named. James Barnes leaves with Murphy, and neither route returns. Jordan Grider leaves blood inside a shelter and no surviving explanation for the first injury. Different places, different decades, different animals, and no single cause connects them. The one question that survives every change of scenery is simpler and darker than any theory about what lives beyond the trail. What happened before the evidence we found began? No scavenger can answer that automatically. No recovery point can safely stand in for it, and no dramatic photograph can replace it. The next time the forest gives back a body, a skull, a jacket, or a few bones, the animal marks may be the first thing everyone sees. Look past them for a moment. Ask what belongs to the living person, what belongs to the aftermath, and what is missing between the two. Sometimes the most frightening thing in the case is not the predator that was found. It is the few minutes before that predator arrived when something happened and left almost nothing behind. That is the moment we are actually searching for. This is Echo 7.